So if you're writing a fantasy novel, there's a good chance you're making one of these 9 critical world building mistakes. And the problem is that any one of these could ruin your story. I know that because after working with over 90 fantasy writers in my coaching programs, I see the same world building mistakes come up again and again. And from my own experience as an author, I've had to learn about these mistakes the hard way. But the good news is that once you know how to avoid them, you can instead craft a world that feels utterly captivating and immersive for your readers. And the first mistake is trying to fill every gap. In a 1963 letter, J.R.R. Tolkien wrote that part of the attraction of The Lord of the Rings is, I think, due to the glimpses of a large history in the background, an attraction like that of viewing far off an unvisited island, or seeing the towers of a distant city gleaming in a sunlit mist. To go there is to destroy the magic, unless new unattainable vistas are again revealed. When it comes to building your world as a fantasy writer, you can often face the temptation to try and answer every single question your reader might have, to explain every moment of history, every detail of your magic, every ancestor that led up to your main character's birth. If you feel compelled to know those details, then there is nothing wrong with that. Feel free to go ahead. Just know that you don't have to share all of that information with your reader. It's okay to leave gaps. In fact, gaps can be a feature, not a bug. I mean, what is more interesting here? 2 characters from 2 different nations who absolutely agree on how the world was made, who the gods are, and who started which wars, or 2 characters who have completely different interpretations of all of that information. You know, just like in real life, we disagree on things. That's reality. Often it is the glimpses and mystery of your world building, the stuff that you actually leave up to your reader's imagination, which creates this incredible sense of wonder and curiosity in your story. So even just a little bit of what I like to refer to as tactical inconsistency can go a long way towards making your story feel more realistic. And this actually leads to the next mistake, which I was talking about with some of my fantasy outlining bootcamp students earlier this week. And this second mistake is something I call parallel world building. So let's imagine that you have all these different elements of your world and you're just kind of introducing them as their own independent things. For instance, let's say your magic system is fueled by these gemstones that you swallow. Maybe the ruling class of your story is organized into these different guilds and they each control a specific industry. Maybe there was a great rebellion 2 centuries ago that split your kingdom into 2 regions. Maybe there are these floating cities that hover over the sea in your world. So what's wrong with this picture? Well, we've got a detail about the magic over here, a detail about the society over here, something about the history over here, and then the geography thing last off. And before you can say world builder's disease, you've basically overwhelmed the reader with all these different concepts, none of which relate to each other in a meaningful way. That right there is what I call parallel world building. It is basically when you introduce different things in isolation, and usually it is a big mistake. The reason is that it is hard to remember things when they are just given to you in isolation. You are much better off using what I call hub and spoke world building. So this is where you focus on making readers understand one core idea first. For example, maybe your core idea in this story is that by swallowing different gemstones, you gain different magic powers. Then once your reader understands that and they've got that detail locked in their mind, let's connect that to the society detail about how your ruling class is organized into guilds that control these specific industries. Maybe each guild actually has exclusive rights to different types of gemstones, and that's why the guild system is so powerful, and maybe they're warring with each other as a result of this. Now you can see how we have connected the magic system to the structure of this society. So the reader now understands why the guilds are important and what makes them powerful, and it all relates back to the magic. Then maybe that big rebellion we mentioned that happened 2 centuries ago, perhaps that was caused by a dispute over who should actually have access to these gemstones. So now you're tying the history directly to the magic system and the societal power structures. And then lastly, in terms of those floating cities, maybe you can link that in by saying that's where the guilds have their headquarters, or that's where their main cities are located. Can you see here, as we have linked all these different concepts together, it gives you this chain of ideas to lead readers through, where every concept actually reinforces the others, making it feel so much more cohesive and just a lot easier to hold in your head. The third common world building mistake I see new fantasy writers make is to be trapped in present norms. Sometimes when I'm reading stories by new writers, it just feels like they create all these innovative ideas and really cool concepts, but the characters just kind of behave like modern Western people, even though the pressures that have been created by this unique world building should have probably produced some kind of different behavior within them. In other words, their values, norms, and cultural attitudes are indistinguishable from our own. Now, sometimes that is fine and there is a way to make that work, but it can also be a huge immersion killer. And personally, I think it really limits your scope so much as a writer. And to explain what I mean here, let me share with you this incredible story I heard recently on Lex Fridman's fantastic interview with the Roman historian Gregory Aldrete.
One of the keys to understanding all of Roman history is to understand that this was a people who were obsessed with the past.
Now, Rome originally started out as a monarchy, but the population weren't too satisfied with having kings.
They held a revolution and they kicked out the kings. And one of the guys who played a key role in this was a man named Lucius Junius Brutus. 500 years down the road, a guy comes along, Julius Caesar, who starts to act like a king. Now, as it happens, there is a guy named Brutus in Roman society at this time who's one of Julius Caesar's best friends, Marcus Junius Brutus.
Now, if you know your Roman history, you probably know where this is going.
People go to Brutus's house and write graffiti on it that says, "Remember your ancestor." And at that point, he really has no choice. And on the Ides of March 44 BC, he and 23 other senators take daggers, stick them in Julius Caesar, and kill him for acting like a king.
I just found this so fascinating when I heard this podcast a few days ago, because the idea that your past is so important and has such power to shape your present decisions that it forces you to kill your best friend because of something that happened 500 years ago, that is absurd to you and me today. But it was a cultural norm that was widely accepted in Rome. Their whole society was based around this reverence for the past. And that is the kind of interesting territory to dig into and to consider exploring in your fantasy novel. When you write, you are inventing your own world. And as long as you can make it feel internally believable within the context of your story, you can come up with whatever norms and cultural standards you want. It doesn't necessarily mean that you endorse or support those ideas, but to me, that is some of the most interesting territory to dig into and opens up so much room for originality. This leads me to the fourth common world-building mistake I see new fantasy writers make: not writing convincing logistics. There is nothing worse than having some massive logistical error in your novel, or just getting some detail about technology or practice or something like this so absurdly wrong that it just shatters your reader's suspension of disbelief. This is certainly a mistake I have made many times in my early drafts. For example, if you look at the early drafts of Kingdom of Dragons, I wrote a scene where a character is hunting a deer. And the deer gets shot with an arrow, and then my character jumps on the back of the creature and slits its throat with a knife to finish it off. Luckily, one of my amazing beta readers, a guy called Louise, who actually went through my story coaching program as well, had a bit of real-world hunting experience. And when he was giving me his comments on my manuscript, he pointed out that an experienced bow hunter would never do this. There's just too much risk of the deer bucking and writhing and injuring you if you are jumping on this thing. Instead, you would just use your bow and arrow to approach it from a safe distance and finish it off with a clean shot. So I updated the story to fix that. And later on, I did actually end up cutting this hunting scene entirely just for some pacing reasons, but that is a different point of discussion. The point being here is you might be thinking right now, Jed, was this logistics issue with the hunting really a big issue? And the answer I would say is no. Most readers probably wouldn't care. But for the very small portion of readers who actually knew how to hunt, this would have completely taken them out of the book. And if they can't trust me to write accurately about the experience of hunting, which is obviously something that has a real world equivalent, then why would they believe me when I tell them about my dragons or my floating city or my magic? In other words, the quote unquote fake world stuff. And if you are looking for a great resource to better understand the world so that you can be writing more convincing logistics, then I highly recommend reading The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization, which is actually the sponsor for today's video. This is such an awesome book. And for a bit of context, I've probably had a few hundred companies reach out to sponsor this channel this year, but this is actually the first one I've said yes to. And that is because this book basically shows you all of the logistics behind the most significant technological innovations we've created as a species. Plus, it's got hundreds of incredible illustrations throughout. And I just love, personally, as a fantasy writer here, I just love how wildly creative the drawings are. They're not just these boring technical schematics. They're so inventive and they're so fresh, and I feel like there's just so much inspiration the art has given me over the past couple of weeks of reading through this book. The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization actually raised over $2 million on Kickstarter a few years ago, and it has all these amazing reviews. And personally, I just think that having something like this gives you such a boundless well of inspiration. So if you want to grab your own copy of The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization, you can go to jedherne.com/rebuild and use the code JEDBOOK10 for a 10% discount. A big thanks to Hungry Minds Publishing for sponsoring this video. Now, the fifth common world building mistake I often see new fantasy writers make is to be writing objective descriptions. When you are writing your story, in most cases, you should not be trying to write a guidebook that objectively describes your world. You are writing about a character's subjective experience of that world. You want to filter your descriptions through your character's perspective. So let me give you an example of what I mean. Here we have a kind of typical tavern scene. But let's imagine that you are describing this tavern through the perspective of a thief. What kind of details are you going to mention? Maybe the thief is going to describe the fact that, oh, it looks kind of dark over in that corner, so that's probably going to be the easiest place to pickpocket some stuff from people. These patrons don't look particularly wealthy. Maybe I should move on to some other place and try my luck there. Maybe I can go up to this table and become friends with those 4 people over there, get them all drunk, and then maybe go back to one of their houses afterwards and hope that there's more valuable things for me to steal there. So you can see here how the description of this tavern has been filtered through the thief's perspective. That tells you a lot about the character's personality. But let's now imagine that your perspective character is a young farm boy who has never really visited the big city before. They've never really spent a lot of time in taverns. How would that character describe this location? Maybe they think about the fact that, oh, it's really noisy in here, or everyone's shouting at each other, and oh, the floor is sticky. What is this? This is kind of disgusting. And oh, there's someone playing music over there though. Ah, that's kind of exciting. Oh, why is this person, leaning on me with horrible breath breathing into my ear? Oh, they must be drunk. And you can see here how that description is also telling us a lot about the person who is entering this setting. In many ways, this is actually the secret to getting your world building across effectively in your story. You want to think about the world building and your descriptions not just as a tool to describe your setting, but as a way to reflect your character and also to progress your plot as well. The more interconnectedness you can have here, where every description of your world also advances our understanding of your main point of view character and maybe hints at some conflicts that are going to come in the plot later on, the more cohesive it's going to feel, and the less it's going to feel like you're writing a info dump. And you may even get to the point where readers just love the perspective your character has when they describe aspects of your world, that you can kind of throw your character into any scenario and they're going to describe it in a really interesting way. The sixth common world building mistake I see new fantasy writers make is to treat their world as being static. One of the big world building lessons I learned from writing my interactive fantasy novel, Siege of Treblan, is to treat your world as a liquid rather than as a solid. Oftentimes, fantasy writers default to creating worlds that feel very static and unchanging, where everything is just locked in a kind of medieval stasis and the world doesn't really look so different now compared to when it was 1,000 years ago. And now, don't get me wrong, that can be the right approach for some stories. But when I was writing Siege of Treblan, I really wanted to create a very dynamic world where your decisions as the player character have significant consequences. So by the end of that story, your city could be destroyed by the enemy army, or maybe you have defeated the enemy instead. There are religious disputes, and maybe they have torn your city apart. Or perhaps you figured out how to solve them in a peaceful way. The relationships you have with other characters as well, they could go in a direction where they either flourish or they turn really sour. The changing of your world, the recontextualizing of things, the destruction of things, the creation of things, that can actually be an incredibly powerful tool to produce emotion in your story. I think that Joe Abercrombie did this brilliantly in his Age of Madness series, which basically shows this medieval fantasy world that gets dragged kicking and screaming into a equally brutal industrial age. And people have to deal with the revolution and political turmoil that comes along the way. Change is really the whole point of that story. And even on a smaller level, if you think about Privet Drive in Harry Potter, for most of the series, it's a super dreary place. It represents the repression of the Dursley family. But in the last book, when Harry realizes that, hey, I'm leaving Privet Drive for the last time, it recontextualizes our relationship to this place by making Harry oddly emotional about this final parting. Mistake number 7 is writing boring info dumps. So you probably don't need me to tell you that info dumps suck, but what actually makes a bad info dump? I would say it's when you give readers information that they didn't ask for and have no interest in receiving. What makes a good info dump, on the other hand, is when you give readers information they desperately want. I like to call this the invited info dump. You want to write as many invited info dumps as possible in your story. But let me give you an example of a bad info dump and then a good info dump that actually has this sort of invited approach. First of all, the bad example here. Two characters are walking through a forest and you suddenly start telling the reader about the history of this kingdom they live in. You list every single king that's been around for the last 500 years, the various political alliances at play, and the economic structure that your culture uses. But because your characters aren't discussing this information and it has zero relevance to their current situation, it just feels like an unwanted lecture. Okay, let's fix that example. Let's imagine that you have two soldiers and they're walking through a dangerous forest and they find the ruins of an ancient battlefield from 500 years ago. Maybe it's like a half-destroyed castle or something. And one character explains to the other that this was where their kingdom's fiercest battle throughout history was fought. And now there's these artifacts that are hidden there, and if they can find them, they might hold some kind of secrets or magical properties that could radically alter the course of the war they're currently fighting. So what's the difference there? Well, you can probably see that your characters have a much better motivation to explain your world building. And as a result, it doesn't feel like an info dump. It just feels like we are progressing the story and maybe revealing something about your characters as well through the way that they are telling that backstory. The next big world building mistake is to be writing cultural monoliths. When you're building your fantasy world, it is so tempting to just give different races or cultures one core defining trait. You might have the warrior race, you might have the hippie forest people race, you might have the sneaky merchant traders race. And that can be a good starting point. And for cultures that your reader only has a brief interaction with, that may be okay. But in real life, even the most homogenous cultures contain multitudes in terms of their thinking, their religious attitudes, their social expectations, their goals, personality types, and every other aspect of the human condition. And that complexity, I think, should be a really key part of your world building if you want to make it feel vibrant and real. So if we consider that warrior culture we just described there, sure, they may say that strength and honor is really pivotal and really important to them, but maybe not everyone in that society thinks the same way, or they disagree on what strength and honor actually looks like. Maybe some people resent the focus on combat and they instead want to pursue more artistic sensibilities, or they want to pursue more diplomatic means to solving their conflicts. And even in the context of war, maybe some warriors value strategy a lot, while others just want to charge in there with brute force. When you can add all these different attitudes and contradictions within a culture, it makes it so much more interesting and realistic. And it also gives you so many more opportunities for conflict and meaningful tension in your story. And then the next common world building mistake is feeling like you need to know everything about your world before you start writing. I work with a lot of fantasy writers in my different programs. At the moment, I'm wrapping up cohort 4 of my fantasy outlining bootcamp, and we were talking about world building a lot this week. And one of the things that can be difficult as a new writer is feeling like you need to know every single aspect of your world before you can actually start writing that first draft. Now, I am a big advocate of outlining and trying to have a good amount of planning and an understanding of your structure before you dive into a story. But sometimes with world building, you do need to accept that you can fill in a lot of the details later on. And so sometimes I go into stories and I have a super clear idea of all the world building I plan to explore. Other times, things are a little bit sketchier, shall we say. So for example, when I was writing Kingdom of Dragons, there is a sequence in this where Rovan, who is this spy who has infiltrated Elysium, the floating city of the Dragon Riders, to destroy it from within, he basically uses this amulet. And this amulet takes him into a vision of the past so that he can communicate with his master about what he's getting up to on his undercover mission. Now, in the first draft, I knew that I wanted to use those scenes in the amulet to kind of have almost a little backstory of the world's history. And I wanted to showcase this kind of sequence that takes place 700 years ago about these eldritch entities that once ruled the planet of Ahara. And so what I did in the first draft is those scenes where Rovan goes into the amulet and he talks with his master, it was literally just the dialogue. That was it. Then when I'd finished the first draft, I counted up all those scenes, and I think there were 5 or 6 of them off the top of my head, and I did a little mini outline of how I could weave this sub-story through those vision scenes. And then I ended up writing that as its own thing. There have been a lot of readers who've told me that they really enjoyed that backstory and how it made the world feel so much more alive and kind of rich with all this history and lore. but it was not a detail that I had from the very beginning. And actually, there's a lot of key aspects of that world building that are now playing into the second book, as I'm in the process of writing that at the moment. I'm about 75% of the way through the first draft of the sequel. And that is just an example I bring up to show you that you can quite easily figure out a lot of the world building details later on in the process. Now, if you want to learn more unique world building techniques from my own experience as an author, then you should check out this video over here. Inside that, I share 15 advanced world building tactics I've learned from writing my 4 novels and my video game. Keep writing and keep striving.